Moonshine Life Group. What is wild yeast? By J.B. Wagonmaker. Wild yeast refers to the naturally occurring yeasts found in the environment, particularly on fruits, grains, and in the air. Unlike commercial yeasts, wild yeasts are not bred for consistency and can produce varied results. Harvesting wild yeast. You can capture wild yeast by setting out a mixture of water and sugar under a fruit tree, or by mashing up ripe berries with water and sugar to let the natural yeasts on the berries ferment. 1. Pros of using wild yeast. Unique flavors. Wild yeast can impart complex and unique flavors that are not achievable with commercial yeasts. Local terroir. Using wild yeast can give your moonshine a sense of place, reflecting the local environment's flora. Natural process. It's a more traditional and natural method of fermentation, which can be appealing to some distillers. Cons of using wild yeast. Unpredictability. Wild yeast can be unpredictable, leading to inconsistent alcohol levels and flavors. Risk of contamination. There's a higher risk of contamination from unwanted bacteria or wild strains that can spoil your mash. Longer fermentation. Wild yeast often ferments more slowly than commercial yeast, which can extend the production time. Tips for using wild yeast. Start with a small batch. Experiment with a small batch first to see if you like the results before committing to a larger volume. Monitor closely. Keep a close eye on the fermentation process, checking for off flavors or signs of contamination. Be patient. Allow extra time for fermentation when using wild yeast, as it may take longer than expected. Using wild yeast for moonshine is a way to connect with the traditional roots of distilling and can add a unique profile to your spirit. However, it requires patience and a willingness to embrace the unpredictability of the process. Capturing wild yeast from the environment is a fascinating process that allows you to harness the unique local flavors of your area for use in baking or brewing. Here's a simple guide on how to do it. Choose your source. Wild yeast can be found on the skins of fruits, grains, and in the air. Dried fruits, such as raisins or apricots, are a common choice because they're rich in natural sugars and yeast. Prepare the vessel. Take a clean jar and fill it with your chosen fruit. Fresh fruits, vegetables, or herbs can also be used, but dried fruits provide a more consistent result for beginners. Add water. Pour filtered water into the jar, covering the fruit by at least an inch. The water provides a moist environment for the yeast to thrive. Cover and store. Seal the jar loosely with a lid or a cloth to allow some air exchange and store it at room temperature, away from direct sunlight. Wait and observe. Over the next few days, check for signs of fermentation, such as bubbles or a frothy layer forming on top of the water. This indicates that wild yeast is present and active. Strain and use. Once the water is bubbly and has a pleasant yeasty smell, usually after about 3 to 5 days, strain out the fruit and the liquid is ready to use as a wild yeast starter. Remember, capturing wild yeast is more of an art than a science, and results can vary. It's a process of trial and error, so don't be discouraged if your first attempt doesn't work as expected. With patience and practice, you'll be able to capture wild yeast and add a unique touch to your homemade moonshine or other fermented products. Wild yeast fermentation and commercial yeast fermentation are two distinct processes, each with its own characteristics and outcomes. Here's how they differ. Wild yeast fermentation. Diversity of microorganisms. Wild yeast involves a variety of naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria found in the environment, which can contribute to a complex flavor profile. Unpredictability. The fermentation process with wild yeast is less predictable, leading to variations in flavor, alcohol content, and fermentation time. Unique flavors. Each batch can have unique flavors due to the different strains of wild yeast and their interactions with the environment. Slow fermentation. Wild yeasts often ferment more slowly than commercial strains, which may result in a longer fermentation process. Terroir influence. Wild yeast can impart a sense of terroir, reflecting the specific characteristics of the location where it was harvested. Commercial yeast fermentation. Consistency. Commercial yeast strains are selected and cultivated to produce consistent results in terms of flavor, alcohol content, and fermentation time. Predictability. The use of commercial yeast leads to a more predictable and controlled fermentation process. Optimized strains. Commercial yeasts are often optimized for specific types of fermentation, such as brewing beer or making wine, and may have higher alcohol tolerance. Standardized flavors. While commercial yeast can produce high-quality results, the flavors tend to be more standardized and less complex compared to wild yeast. In summary, wild yeast fermentation offers a natural and unique approach with varied outcomes, while commercial yeast provides a more controlled and consistent fermentation process. Both methods have their own advantages and can be chosen based on the desired result and the distiller's preference. Cheers! Moonshine Life Recipes Group.